All right. Well, welcome everybody and good evening. I hope you're doing well out there tonight. Welcome to the UC Santa Barbara Fall Virtual Seminar Series titled From the First Humans to Forest Fires, Scientific Discoveries Spanning UC Santa Barbara's 7 Spectacular Reserves. My name is Marianne Whitman. I'm the Executive Director of the UCSB Natural Reserve System. And I'm just so happy that you're joining us tonight. I think you're in for just a wonderful talk and a just lovely evening. As always, I want to get started with a few housekeeping items. So tonight's format will be speaker presentations with Q&A at the end. Unfortunately, we can't hear from you, but we can read your questions. So please access your Q&A at the bottom of your screen and please send them along. And at the end, we'll have a moderated Q&A session and your questions for Dr. Bisbing or our Reserve Director, Keith Seydel. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can, and we look forward to them. Also, tonight's seminar will be recorded, and it will be available on the UCSB Natural Reserve System YouTube channel. So if you want to pass it along to anyone or watch it again, then that will be available to you. You'll get a follow-up email after tonight's seminar that has a link to the YouTube channel so you can easily find it. So, all right, tonight we're going to embark on the third of our 7-part series and virtual tour of the UC Santa Barbara Natural Reserve System. So hopefully if you've been to the first 2 seminars, you're starting to get a sense of what all the kind of science and research and amazing habitats that our NRS, our Natural Reserve System, has to offer. But some of you may still be wondering, what is the NRS? What is the UC NRS? So let me explain that a little bit. The Natural Reserve System is a network of protected lands in California, managed by the University of California system for the purposes of research, university level education, and public service. The UC system altogether has 41 reserves, and each UC campus manages some of those 41. UC Santa Barbara manages 7 of these 41, and I might be biased, but I think they're maybe the best. So tonight we're going to hear about Rancho Marino Reserve, and I'm going to let Keith Seydel, the Reserve Director there, introduce it. But first, I just wanted to kind of remember where we've been so far. Our first seminar was about Santa Cruz Island Reserve, and we heard Dr. Amy Gussick talk about underwater archaeology there. Then last week, we moved a little bit north up to the Carpinteria Salt Marsh Reserve, and which was probably my favorite experience learning about parasites. If you've missed those 2 lectures, again, go to our YouTube site and you can catch those again. And tonight, we're going to move up north to the Rancho Marino Reserve, which is located in Cambria, California. It's an amazing place, and it's a site of a lot of long-term research. And we've hosted classes from all kinds of universities, UC Santa Barbara and others, for many, many years. And tonight's speaker is Dr. Sarah Bisbing, and she's from the University of Nevada, Reno. And she's going to talk about her research at Rancho Marino. So I can't wait to hear your talk tonight, Sarah. First, I'm going to introduce Keith Seydel. Keith is our Reserve Director at Rancho Marino. He is the rookie of the group, and he started his job sometime last year. We're very lucky to have him, though, because before Keith worked for us at the Natural Reserve System, he worked at the UC Santa Barbara LTER, or Long-Term Ecological Research Network, which is an NSF-funded program. So he knows a lot about facilitating science, about being in the field, and doing everything that a reserve director needs to do to make sure science and classes can happen. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Keith, and thank you everybody tonight for joining us. We hope you'll enjoy learning about science as it happens at a reserve.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third seminar in the UCP Natural Reserve System Fall Seminar Series. I would also like to welcome you all to the Kenneth Norris Rancho Marino Reserve. I'm going to give you a quick tour of the reserve before we head on into the seminar. Rancho Marino Reserve is a beautiful 600 acres, and it joined the Natural Reserve System back in 2001. I actually joined the reserve system 1 year ago yesterday, so I truly am the newbie to this area. The reserve is located on the Central Coast, just south of the city of Cambria. This picture is from the north looking south. And you can see this is Cambria, and right over this ridge here is Highway 1 running on south down to Quercus, Morro Bay, and on into San Luis Obispo. One of the unique things about Rancho Marino is that it actually encompasses 4 different habitat types, and that moves from the ocean up into the 700-foot ridge there. This allows a wide variety of research to be done here and attracts researchers and classes from all over the globe, actually. Our users are mostly from the UC system. We also have a lot from the California State Colleges, California Community Colleges, and from places as far away as universities in the United Kingdom. About half of the current research here at Rancho Marino is marine-based. The 2 miles of coastline provide researchers with a really undisturbed rocky intertidal habitat for experimentation or for monitoring studies. In addition to this protected coastline, the ranch is fully encompassed in the White Rock Marine Protected Area, and this allows subtidal researchers to access the state protected waters that are just offshore that run from the coastline out to about a half mile from shore. Along the bluffs, the coastal prairie takes up about 225 acres of the reserve. Historically, this area was used for some row crop, and from the mid-1800s until the 1940s, there was a dairy farm operation here. In the 1940s, that changed to a beef cattle operation, and there was actually some grazing actually ongoing still at this time. Along this prairie, there's a lot of experiments on various different things, but one of the major ones is exclusions from grazing and non-grazing that actually show the effect of grazing on native versus invasive plant interactions. The grazing is also used as a fire abatement ability to keep the grass at a low level. Not yet. As we move up the foothills, we run into this coastal scrub area, and it has a lot of different types of sages growing in there, and it's mostly concentrated on the southern end of the reserve, covers about 40 acres, and it's on these steep slopes that you see here in the foreground of this picture. The 4th habitat is the one you'll be hearing more about tonight. This is the coastal forest, and it has Monterey Pine and coastal live oak growing in it. We have about 220 acres of this mixed forest, mostly in the northern part of the reserve, running from about 100-foot elevation up to the 700-foot peak of the foothills there. Although Monterey Pine is actually grown, it's cultivated around the world for lumber and for pulp. There's actually only 5 native stands of Monterey Pine left in the world. 3 of them are in the US, and 2 of them are in Mexico. The Cambria forest is one of those, and Rancho Marino protects a portion of that forest, and that native Monterey Pine forest allows for research like you will be hearing tonight. The reserve also has 2 stock ponds and 2 seasonal streams, which gives us a little bit of a flavor of some wetland area, but just a little flavor. There's not much here. A quick note on the residents of the reserve. We have a 43 terrestrial mammals that have been found on the reserve. We're always looking to expand that, and you never know when you find something new. We've seen 132 different bird species here at Rancho Marino. And actually right now we have some researchers who are working on seasonal differences of the species list. And we're trying to see if we're missing some migratory birds that come through rarely. We also have 225 species of plants that have been cataloged on the reserve. And that list was just updated this past year from a researcher at UCSB, actually. If you have any questions about the reserve, I'll be happy to answer them in the Q&A or over email later if you want to email me. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you tonight's speaker. Sarah Bisbing is a assistant professor at University of Nevada, Reno. She's also the director of the Whittle Forest and Wildlife Area. She received her PhD in forest ecology from Colorado State University back in 2013. And after that, she moved to San Luis Obispo, here on the Central Coast, Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and was a professor there. And that is when she started working here at the ranch. In 2017, she moved to the University of Nevada, Reno, but thankfully she continues to work here at the reserve. So with that, here we go, Oaks by the Sea. And Sarah, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you, Keith, for the introduction and for the invitation to speak. And thank you for the many people that are here on a Thursday night at 7 p.m. I hope it's as riveting as something on Netflix would have been, but thanks for taking the time. I'm sorry we can't do this in person. It's way more fun and I appreciate the interaction. So I hope you'll give me some good questions in the discussion or in the chat box. And if not, at the end of the talk, I have my email address and then 2 of my websites so you can peruse some of the work that we're doing. But to start off, I just want to say it's a pleasure to really have the opportunity to talk about Rancho Marino. It is an exquisitely beautiful place that is one of the best places you could do research. I keep coming back year after year just because I'm so drawn to that landscape and the people that work there. So it's a pleasure to fill you in on what's happening in the Monterey Pine Forest in Cambria, and more specifically, what's happening within the Rancho Marino property. Tonight, I'm playing off of this a little bit, but Monterey Pine in Cambria, Rancho Marino, the slogan for the town is Pines by the Sea. And for those of you that know the town and know the area, you see that on signs coming in and out. I'm playing off of that with Oaks by the Sea because of a little bit of a preview of what we're going to find on this long-term demographic study. My colleagues on this come from a range of universities, so University of Nevada, Reno, a master's student at Cal Poly while I was there, a colleague in Denver, and then the former reserve manager, Don Canestro, actually initiated this study and led the data collection before handing it over to my lab in 2014. So let's dive right in and let's go over some context first for why we're talking about this at large and why Monterey Pine matters and is worthy of study. So many of the scientists that are on this call are familiar with this figure, but I'll walk everyone else through it so that we're all on the same page. So what we're looking at the top is climate over time, change in temperature in degrees Celsius. We have this long-term record over geologic time, right? And on the right-hand side, we have Holocene and the future predictions based on current climate conditions and based on models. The 20th century record we see moving across towards the right. And then the box I've highlighted in green are the climatic change predictions for the future in terms of temperature. You can see from ensemble modeling that there are quite a few options, some extreme options and some less extreme options. But regardless, we see increases in temperature going forward that are pretty dramatic, even in the most benign scenario. As a plant ecologist and forest ecologist specifically, we often track the effects of climate change on adult survival and juvenile survival, so baby trees across the landscape. And what we know is that even though an adult may be adapted to a particular set of conditions, a juvenile tends to be more constrained, right? Its ability to tolerate and be successful is constrained by those more extreme climatic conditions, and it has a narrow niche, narrow set of conditions it can grow under. We also know that species are strongly locally adapted, and for conifers in particular, despite high gene flow and connectivity in many of our populations, they're very strongly adapted to the temperature and the moisture that they have grown over for many centuries. And so what you see on the left is a schematic of color going from warm to cold, representing yellow to blue. And here we have these 3 different tree species that are color coded based on what they're adapted to. What we anticipate for the future, however, is that given that trees are very slow to migrate and climate change is anticipated to exceed the rate at which they can move, that many of these individuals will die off in their local environment. And we will potentially start to see shifts in species distributions, higher in latitude or higher in elevation. But at large, many of the species will not be able to track this change where warm is now hot and cold is now warm across their distributions. The consequence of this is we've already seen pretty catastrophic global forest mortality. Craig Allen put together 2 papers in 2010 and 2015 that summarize these mortality events. And the red dots in here were part of his update paper. So these extreme mortality events are considered continuing across the globe. So just a little context, it's not just California. Now I'm going to turn to California, though, since this is our beloved state, and we've seen some pretty catastrophic effects of climate change on our landscape and our forest ecosystems in particular. So many, if not all of you, are familiar with our most recent drought, which was one of the worst in California history. The drought rain occurred between 2012 and 2016, with starts of the drought occurring in 2011. But many of the consequences of the drought, at least on plant species and trees in particular, occurring after that time frame, after they'd been exposed to many years of this drought. What you see on the top left figure are the historic drought indice conditions, and on the right were the last 20 plus years. You can also see on the bottom, this figure shows the progression of drought over time from 2012 at the start of the drought to just after the end of the drought in 2017. The color schematic, the darker the red, the more extreme the drought. You can see that the peak of the drought occurred in 2014 and 2015, but in the Southern Sierra and Southern California that extended even further into 16 and 17. So what this looked like is we started to see tree mortality on the landscape. And this is interesting from 2 perspectives. One, the maps that you're looking at are maps that are flown by Forest Health and Protection with the US Forest Service and augmented with other data, where every year they track tree mortality and they try to give it an agent that's killing those trees. This is the map from all of those aerial surveys done in 2014. And what you see in the yellow, if you look at my legend in the top right, the yellow is what we call background mortality. It's the mortality we expect to occur in any given forest landscape, and that ranges typically between about 1% and 5% of the trees that are there on average. I'm going to speed forward to 2018, and here's what our forests look like in terms of mortality by 2018. And I mentioned in the last slide that a big chunk of this mortality was occurring in 2016 and 2018. And the primary reason for that is my second interesting point, which is conifers can tolerate a decent amount of stress. So they can go a few years where they're able to persist with extreme drought stress and hit some threshold at which they no longer can persist under those extreme conditions. You can see in the map on the right that the most extreme mortality occurred in lower elevations, so above these oak woodlands in these early transitions to pine forests across the Sierra Nevada and up into the mixed conifer forest in the Sierra Nevada. By the end of the drought, these are the stats that we're looking at. So you can see the bottom right figure is not mine. I would have color coded that differently, so I apologize, it's borrowed. But what you see on the y-axis here is number of dead trees. On the x-axis, you see these bins of years. 2010 to 2014 are binned together because at the time we thought that was a catastrophic period. However, when we started to track the data over time, we realized that the peak of mortality was actually 2016. You can see by 2018 that cumulatively we lost 148 million trees across the state of California. And that's that same map on the left-hand side that you're looking at there. Where this relates to Monterey Pine is that those of us that were living on the Central Coast started to see the impacts of this immediately. So with changes in fog and changes in precipitation to the coast, Monterey Pine appeared to be particularly sensitive to this drought event. So starting in 2014, this is our same figure that we've seen in the last few slides with the majority yellow, that's background mortality. You can't really see San Luis Obispo here or Santa Barbara, but we're in this region here. And you can't even see that little mortality dot, so I zoomed it in for you. So on the right, what you're looking at is what we consider moderate to high mortality in a forest ecosystem. So between that 5 to 40 trees per acre that are dying on that landscape. The property that we're talking about today is at the core of this red blob in Cambria, right, just south of this town. And so you can see that this, I'm calling it a canary tree, right? It's sort of this first indicator of mortality that's about to occur across this landscape. And so we're going to talk about what we know about Monterey Pine success and mortality from this long-term data set that Don put together and what we can do about it or think about going forward. So let's zoom into Monterey Pine. Keith already gave us a nice introduction to the species. What you're looking at here is a map of 2 of the coastal endemics. So Pinus radiata is Monterey pine, and that's what I call it throughout the talk. So I'll use the scientific name. Pinus muricata is bishop pine. It's a close sister species of Monterey pine. It is a species that is highly adapted to fire. We think that Pinus radiata or Monterey pine is adapted to fire, but it doesn't have the clear adaptations that the other species does, which is cones that require fire to open. If you look at the distribution along the coast, the yellow blobs are our Pinus muricata distribution, and the orange blobs here, which represent the 3 populations that Keith mentioned, are our 3 Monterey pine populations along the coast of California. I'm going to mix my units throughout this talk because I teach forestry classes, but it's approximately 6,000 acres across the 3 intact Monterey pine populations in California. The reason why I present both species here is that paleo records have shown us that pine was historically far more extensive across the coast of California. So areas where you now see chaparral or coast redwood or other species, pine historically played a larger role, and we've based that on research from the pollen record. Right now, both of these species are pretty constrained to the coast in a few endemic populations, and particularly Monterey pine. So interesting, and also something that we think very clearly about from a conservation perspective. What does it mean for the species? The map in the top right is just showing you the places where Monterey pine is planted globally. So as Keith mentioned, it's a #1 timber species. It is planted all over the world. In Australia and New Zealand, it is their #1 timber species. I think the statistic is in New Zealand, it's 90% of the timber industry. And there they grow into these beautiful tall boles that create incredible logs that can be utilized in timber. Where they grow on the coast of California, they're more of these gnarled trees occurring in these soil conditions. So it's an interesting example of taking a plant and having it be far more successful in another location, right? When it's released from some of these stressful constraints. Monterey pine and bishop pine are both documented to be fog dependent. If you've spent any time on the coast of California, especially the central coast, you know it's incredibly arid. Research has shown that a large portion of the precipitation that these trees are taking in from the coast redwoods on south is via fog input. And so this is an older paper that's showing fog input into the coast redwood landscape. And you're just looking at changes in fog frequency over the course of a day in this figure C here. And then in figure D is the reason why I actually present this. This is looking at change in fog frequency over time and the predictions for fog frequency going forward. And again, this is just a single paper and a single model, but it's one example of where we see impacts to fog declining over the future period with increasing climate change. Another example, so this is a paper that she was a PhD student in the UC system. She looked at mortality associated with fog with bishop pine. And what you're looking at here is you can see probability of mortality that's highest are in these brown colors. So along these areas where we saw pretty dramatic decreases in fog over that drought, the start of that drought period, they were seeing upwards of 75% mortality of those trees. So some clear responses to these fog events and lack of fog. I'm going to dive into artwork though now, and I would be remiss if I didn't introduce this as Don's study. So Don Canestro, the former reserve director, started this study. I think he arrived in Rancho Marino in 2001 or 2002. That year and the previous years, a number of papers had come out saying that the Monterey Pine Cambria forest was doomed. And that was as a result of the introduction of the non-native pathogen pine pitch canker. And what we were seeing as scientists and as citizen scientists and as observers was a decent amount of mortality across the landscape. And it really alarmed people that this endemic coastal conifer was going to be lost from the landscape. And in particular, as with the play on my title, the town is known as Cambria by the Sea, right? And so altering that landscape would be really, really catastrophic for that community. So what Don did is in 2002, he laid out a series of transects. He's a marine biologist, and marine biologists, I guess, use transects because this is not what we have done since then, but I love it. And I hope that that's making you all laugh at your 7:30 p.m. PowerPoint lecture. But what you're looking at here is the distribution of the property, the distribution of Monterey Pine, as Keith already introduced, so around 220 acres. And then what Don did, which is really brilliant, is he established these transects across different forest types, or what he considered forest types that were in different phases of succession. And he was doing this by himself with his wife Miranda and their kids, and they didn't have a ton of help. So we've got these 5 transects running across the property. The 2 in the bottom, he called the emerging front transects. The reason they established those is because, as you can see in this picture on the right, this 2002 picture, this is a point post El Nino event, high amounts of winter precipitation, where they saw a wave of Monterey Pine regeneration onto that landscape. And that's what you see across that hill slope there. The picture on the bottom is a picture that Don and I took in 2015. And you can see that a large portion of the mortality occurring in that forest was starting on the there. You're thinking about this edge effect, right? And how populations are expanding and contracting over time. And this is a cool example of that. So he had put 2 transects there. He put 1 transect in an area he called a single size class. So what we mean by that is a more even age forest. The trees are all about the same size and same age. One is a mixed size class, so multiple canopy layer Monterey Pine. And then this top one at higher elevation is where you actually start to see a larger oak component on the forest. As Keith mentioned, coast live oak or Quercus agrifolia. And so this he called this oak pine site. So just a little bit of context for where the data is coming from. Don started sampling these in 2002. We continued to sample them this year in 2020. So we now have a legacy of 18 years of data that we can work off of. Today, I'm going to present on our data that goes through 2016 because we're still actively processing the tens of thousands of trees on the more recent data. So just a little bit of insight into what this looks like now. So one of the interesting things about pine pitch canker is in 1998, these late 90s and early 2000s papers, we expected to see a loss of these species across the landscape due to pine pitch canker. What we've actually seen over time is that yes, pine pitch canker can cause mortality, obviously. However, in a natural forest system, we often see that it leads to dieback of branches, the leaders or the tops of the trees die, or smaller size classes tend to be susceptible to that. We have a few papers that we're working on, but simplicity is just the pitch canker incidence, so the occurrence of it across the landscape. The southern portion is Rancho Marino that you're looking at down here. And then we ended up expanding plots all over the Cambrian Monterey Pine Forest. The main takeaway is that anything in the green to yellow range really isn't a ton of pitch canker. The colors that are in the orange to dark brown burgundy are this more extreme mortality. So it's patchy and it tends to be more extreme in the coast. And we'll talk about that in a little bit later. So as Keith and I have both mentioned, the stars of this show are Quercus agrifolia, coast live oak, and Pinus radiata, Monterey pine. And they are really the exclusive species on Rancho Marino in terms of tree species. As you move away from the coast, some bay laurel and some other species occurring on the landscape, but this is primarily a Monterey pine to coast live oak ecosystem. So what we did is we leveraged Don's long-term data set. We picked up with this with Cal Poly undergrads and Cal Poly master's students. And then I continue to pay students out of my lab to go down there and sample in the winter when they can't sample elsewhere. It's a lovely place to send crew members in the winter. So we leveraged this site and this data set to ask a series of questions related to demography of the conifer. Will it survive? What are the conditions it survives under? What are the conditions it dies under? And what does regeneration look like? And so really simply, so we have something to tie back at the end of the talk. Our first question was just asking, is tree mortality driven more by climate, or what we call endogenous factors, so large scale changes in climatic conditions, or by forest conditions, or exogenous or endogenous factors? And what we mean by those are things like, is the forest, is this non-native pathogen impacting mortality on that stand level? Those are more of our forest site conditions. Our second question is we wanted to specifically ask about how climate is influencing patterns of mortality and regeneration on the landscape. And then finally, as someone who's a more applied scientist and who works closely with land managers, we wanted to know what we can anticipate and what we can manage for with climate change. So a little bit of context climatically, there are 3 figures here. On the y-axis, you have 3 different climates or climate variables. So mean annual temperature in degrees Celsius on the top panel, precipitation in millimeters on the middle panel, and relative humidity in percent on the bottom panel. The reason I include relative humidity is there's no really good fog data at the scale that we need it. And I can talk about that in comments or chats later. You can email me because I won't take up my time talking about that, but we don't have good enough data necessarily that's available easily to use. So we're using relative humidity as a surrogate. The dates that you're looking at here cover the range of the year prior to the first year of sampling, so 2001, all the way through this 2015 to 2016 period, where we are the annual temperature over the course of the drought, we see an increase in mean temperature. The real impact to it, however, was this dramatic decrease in total precipitation. So from 2010 to 2015, we saw this continual decline in the total amount of precipitation. Finally, we see relative humidity on the bottom. It's relatively stable over the course of that period. 2 other climates variables that I just want to touch on really quickly because they matter. The top is frost-free period. For many of you, you know that as the growing season or growing degree days, and that's what's represented here. You can see on average that at the Rancho Marino forest, they have on about 310 to 320 growing degree days a year, which is incredible, especially for someone who lives in Reno now. And then what we have seen over the course of the drought is that increased exponentially up to closer to 350 days by 2015. So extended periods without water and already limited water due to the drought. The bottom image is showing you days above 18 degrees C. These are considered really extreme heat days, particularly for plant species. You can see we don't really have those typically in Cambria, other than in rare periods, but we saw, again, an exponential increase in the number of these extreme heat days. So more ways to stress these trees. Where I want to focus us now, and I'll walk us through this figure because it can be sort of complicated, is I want to talk about what a tree experiences. And you know, the plant physiologists on here may not love that I'm using this surrogate, but as a forest ecologist, it's something we often turn to, and I'll explain what this is. So what you're looking at here is called climatic water deficit, and it's in millimeters. The simplest way I can explain it is that it's basically the amount of water that a tree would need in order for it to be meeting all of its demands. So if you're going to water your houseplant, how many liters of water do you have to give it a week in order for its photosynthetic demands to be met and in order for it to grow new leaves and be happy, right? So that it would be at a 0. What you're looking at here is the numbers range from 0 to 400 millimeters. So 400 millimeters is this input at that period. And then across the x-axis in months, we go from January to December. So we're looking at that water deficit over the course of the year. And the reason we assume this is something that's a better surrogate for what trees are actually experiencing without us going out and collecting physiology data is that it incorporates what we assume based on soils data is our available soil water. So soils are incorporated into it. We take precipitation, temperatures, these extreme days, your latitude and longitude and your elevation. And it incorporates all of these different variables to calculate what you would expect that tree to be exposed to, rather than just saying, we know rain matters, let's use rain, or precipitation as a potential variable. So what you see here is that over the majority of the study period, so from 2002 to 2015, our CWDs, which is the acronym for this, are hovering near the bottom in winter. They have a peak growing season you expect, and then they drop down. And they tend to hover around the same range, right? Between about 50 and 125 is that maximum range in that summer period. The top 3 lines that are coded in the most brightly colors, the pink, the orange, and the red, these are our most extreme years. These are extreme drought years during that 2012 to 2015 drought period. And you can see that this extreme event, something covering mine, this extreme event of drought in 2015 is really what's driving this high climatic water deficit during this year. So you can see the effects of that drought on this local landscape. What we did in this model is to try to predict how climate water deficit or the stressful variables influencing mortality and regeneration is we built some statistical models. And I like to write this way for the people that want to see some sort of statistical model or response variables, but I also think it's far easier to see than many statistical models. So what we're looking at here is we took Don's long-term data. So we used the trees on the landscape and asked how many died during a given year. What was the mortality? That's on this left side of the equation here. And then we used a series of different variables representing those within forest conditions, so forest density and pitch canker infection, and climatic variables, so the previous year's precipitation. For fog, we use surrogates like relative humidity, and then the CWD or climatic water deficit. So in this model, all we're asking is, do any of these climate or tree site level variables influence whether or not tree dies on the landscape? Similar thing is happening on the bottom, but we're using different variables. So here we're obviously using cone production. Do we have a seed input to that landscape? And then we utilize the same climatic variables to ask about whether or not trees are regenerating on the landscape. So I like to dive right in. I don't like to spend time wasting your time or my time on methods and things like that. So I'm happy to talk with you about that later. But what I'm showing you here is the data. It's the mortality that occurred in the Pinus radiata forest over that entire sampling period. And what I've done here is twofold. First, as you can see in the upper right-hand corner, is my legend. I have the 5 different transects that I introduced you to at the start of the talk. I wanted to leave them separate so we could see if there were any patterns across this time frame. And then what I've done in the figures is this is what's called a Z-score. It's basically standardizing each of your sites to look at relative mortality within your site to what you would expect on average. And the reason we do that with some of our plant data is because sometimes you'll have 10,000 trees in one area and you only have 10 trees die, right? And then in another area you'll have 10 trees in an area and 10 trees will die. So scaling it helps in statistical models. It also helps. There's an pretty. And so what you see in these figures is I have 4 size classes. I've got mature trees in the top left, small trees in the top right, saplings, and saplings in the bottom left, and seedlings in the bottom right. And the reason we broke this into classes goes back to one of my first slides where I said that we expect baby trees to respond differently than adult trees to stress, right? In terms of mortality and in terms of regeneration response. And so we wanted to model these by each of the size classes, and that's what we did. So let's just walk through some of these interesting patterns. The green boxes that are highlighted show that drought period, the 2012 to 2016 period. And the 3 that I've highlighted are the 3 size classes where we saw pretty extreme peaks in mortality of those size classes during that time frame. So for the mature trees, yes, we have a few pulses above that earlier on, but the peak of mortality is occurring during that time frame, primarily in 14 and 15, as I mentioned, are canary trees. And then in the small trees, we see the same thing, a pulse of mortality that's not quite as extreme. Saplings, we see a pulse of mortality. And then regeneration or seedlings, we sort of see them all over the board. And that will make a little bit of sense when we talk through the model, but lots of baby trees established and they all don't make it to the end. It's just sort of what we're looking at here. For Quercus agrifolia, coast live oak, however, when we started to look deeply into this data, I shouldn't have been stunned based on the drought adaptations of the species, but I was sort of stunned. So over the course of this 14 years of data collection, the mature trees, you see that one transect that's popped up here. So this is in the oak pine. That actually represents a single tree. So over this entire time frame, we lost one large diameter tree. And here we're defining large diameter by about above 20 inches in diameter, since Monterey pine doesn't get very large. Same thing with small trees. We had a little bit mortality in saplings. And of course, we expect seedling mortality because they don't all establish and move forward. But really interesting just looking at the data without even looking at any of the models, just knowing that very few oaks died during this mortality event. So diving right into our model results, what you're looking at here, and again, these can be sort of complicated, so I'll talk you through them, is I'm only presenting the variables from our model that ended up being significant. And remember what I asked was, are these within site, so forest density or pitch canker or climatic variables more important in driving these responses? And so that's what I've plotted here, or what matters to these different size classes. So in the top left figure, we have predicted tree mortality. So this is model tree mortality based off of the statistical model. And we have 3 different size classes: mature trees, saplings, and small trees. And you can see for mature trees, they start to see some mortality with that entire level of climatic water deficit, but they don't really peak at any of these more extreme events. Our saplings and our small trees increase with increasing climatic water deficit over the course of that year. And overall, this predictor was most significant in mortality for all of our trees. So for the Monterey pine, climatic water deficit was the most important climatic variable. What we see for mature trees, this predicted mature tree mortality, is that this antecedent or previous year's climatic water deficit matters as well. And we see some peak here in this relationship where mortality peaks around this 1,250 millimeters. It's really interesting. I think this is due to this compounding effect on the landscape, and also the fact that we are losing trees over time, and that's being incorporated into this model. Moving on to the bottom for sapling mortality, in addition to, oops, sorry guys, amateur move. In addition to climatic water deficit mattering, the other variable that mattered in sapling mortality was that pine pitch canker incident. So that non-native pathogen that's been impacting that forest has only been significantly impacting the sapling class on our landscape over the course of this study. And that was significant in driving mortality in that size class. For seedlings, this was our only size class where trees per hectare, or the density or number of trees in the landscape, influenced mortality. And we would expect this as ecologists. We have this understanding of what we call density dependent mortality, where the more plants or the more trees you have in a given area, the less available resources there are. Individuals have to compete, and in the end, some of them lose. And so we expect that for seedlings in particular, because so many of them establish and they don't move into the future. For Pinus radiata, mortality was also significantly related to the previous year's precipitation, and this is for all size classes. And it's sort of this interesting relationship here where we only really see mortality rates starting to decline once we move above about 350 millimeters of precipitation. And then we start to see drops in mortality, but it only stables off once we get to about this 450 or 460 millimeters of precipitation in that previous year. And this was across all size classes. So the previous year's precipitation is clearly mattering as well. For a comparison between Pinus radiata and Quercus agrifolia, for regeneration, both species were influenced by the previous year's rain, led to dramatic increases in the total number of baby trees that established for both species. And then for Monterey pine, cones per hectare mattered. So as we see increases in cones, we see increases in pine regeneration. And for oak, we additionally saw that increases in the current year's precipitation leads to increases in regeneration. You notice that I don't have our coast live oak mortality on there, and because the numbers are so low, you can't actually model it. There's nothing to model. So we've modeled regeneration of both species and mortality of Monterey pine because we had the data to do so. So here is a map that's showing something a little different, and I'll show you a little bit more about what we're doing going forward, but this is a sneak peek into this. We've expanded our sampling across Cambria to install this permanent plot network where we have replicated plots across all these different forest properties and across this Monterey pine forest type. This is the cumulative mortality that occurred on Rancho Marino up to 2017. And so in some areas, we see upwards of 50 to 75% mortality. And then we have some areas where we saw pretty minimal mortality. But this was a site that was impacted, and we saw that at the start of the drought, and we knew that. What we found from our statistical analyses is that climate is more important than forest conditions in general, right? For some of those size classes like the sapling and seedlings, those within site conditions actually matter quite a bit. And where this is concerning though, is that given that climate is so important in driving mortality and driving regeneration, and I've highlighted that like 460 or 470, which is that line at which precipitation or mortality is basically zero, is here we're looking at the precipitation, mean annual precipitation from 1900 to 2080. So as far back as we could go in the records and the predictions for the future. You can see the precipitation was relatively stable. It had a peak in the 70s through 90s. And then we've seen a dramatic decline, and we predict to see an ongoing dramatic decline in mean annual precipitation going forward. Simultaneously, we also expect to see a linear increase in frost-free period and an increase in the days above 18 degrees Celsius. So longer growing seasons, less precipitation, and more extreme heat days. So we expect these to be more stressful conditions for plants on the landscape. And this is the local data for Rancho Marino. So with that, given the lack of mortality in coast live oak over the course of the study, even over the course of this really extreme 4-year drought, and the pretty extensive mortality of Pinus radiata across the landscape, we can anticipate that although Pinus radiata will likely continue to occur and be able to persist on that landscape, Quercus agrifolia is better suited for the conditions that we're experiencing now and better suited for the conditions that are moving forward. And it's sort of a challenging thing to say to people that love this endemic forest, and I do too. I think we need to also think about reframing how we see this forest and thinking about the value and the really exciting aspect of the fact that this tree is so incredible and is persisting. And there may be people in the audience that want to talk about sudden oak death, and we can talk about that separately because that is an impact on the coast as well. But here's what our data is showing us, and here's what we could anticipate going forward with the future predicted conditions. So this is my play on the town's name. I don't necessarily think we're going to see an extreme type conversion, but I think we need to think critically about what's happening and think about our objectives for the forest, what we value in the forest, and what we can do to persist things that match those objectives. So just going back to our 3 questions. So is tree mortality driven more by climate or forest conditions? In general, it's climate, right? So we can treat our forests and that will lead to some benefits for some size classes. However, for many of our size classes, climate is the overriding stressor. We also see these species-specific thresholds in mortality and regeneration, where oak responded differently than Monterey Pine. And then we can potentially anticipate some population declines and some compositional shifts across this landscape, particularly given that coast live oak seems to be well adapted to these conditions. Really quickly, before I wrap up for questions, I just want to show you some of the work that we've expanded to, and I'll march through this as fast as I can given the time frame. But in 2015, we decided to install an extensive plot network across Cambria in order to better sample the range of conditions here. And so what you're looking at here is from 2015 to 2019, just the change in what we call the tree phase across the plots at Rancho Marino. It's a little hard to see, and I'll zoom in the next slide, but green trees represent live, happy trees that are healthy. Flagging trees means that we're starting to see some dieback. Over time, we've always considered this pine pitch canker. More recently, it's been drought mortality. Red trees are trees that died last year. Gray trees are trees that died a few years ago. And tree fall means they're on the ground. You can see this change across the landscape from green to black. And I'm going to zoom in really quickly to one of our sites with low severity mortality, so little mortality, and one with high mortality, so you can see it more closely. And I'm going to zoom into the north end RM22 and the south end RM14 in that emerging front that established after that big precipitation event. So here is plot 22, and it was hard to fit all 4, but here's the baseline in 2015. The black trees, you see a few trees on the ground, a few gray trees means it's older mortality. What you can see as you progress from 2016 across to 2019 is that we have some trees that are flagging, we have a few more dead trees, but we still have a decent number of green trees on that landscape in RM22, so a lower severity mortality event. However, we switched to plot 14, which is that same area as the emerging front. In 2015, we still had extensive live trees, these green trees. And then by the time we get to 2019, you can see the majority of trees are in this black or this gray phase. So trees that have died over the past few years and trees that died years ago at the start of the drought that have now fallen. What this looks like across the landscape, so again, we sampled much beyond Rancho Marino, is all of these greens. The dark greens mean little mortality, the lighter greens mean more mortality. From 2015 to 19 is what's shown here. You can see that across the landscape, the majority of this mortality was occurring along this coastline. So changes in fog, changes in precipitation, extreme events, and this more extreme exposed slope at lower elevation is what we're thinking. The other thing just to touch on again, since I told you pitch canker wasn't important to all size classes, is here's a map showing pitch canker incidence across the landscape. As you get to the more purple and pink, that's high incidence of pitch canker. And you can see that it's clustered mostly at our beloved Rancho Marino. One of the reasons that we think that this is happening is based on the distance from the coast. So a paper came out in 2003 by Wickler and colleagues that found that the largest portion of mortality that was occurring in these Monterey Pine that were impacted by pine pitch canker was within about a half mile of that coastline. So moisture conditions, more spread via wind and via moisture in that atmosphere, and potentially a better host ground for this pathogen. So thinking about the future so that I'm not ending on a super negative note, because it's not super negative. Forests are awesome and we should appreciate them. So on the top we have, in both of these, what we're looking at is forest ecosystem services. So what do we have or what do we value in a forest? And then these are conceptual figures that were produced by Connie Millar and Nate Stevenson, pretty famous forest ecologists. What you're looking at here is just a change in a forest over time. In the first schematic on the top, what you're seeing is here's our lovely forest, our beloved forest in 1 and 2. We see some catastrophic event that leads to pretty extensive mortality. And then we see what's called a type conversion. So a shift from one ecosystem type to another ecosystem type. The figure on the bottom is what Connie and Nate are arguing we should be doing in these forests, given that we understand what's happening, we know the potential consequences of type conversions on the landscape. And it's basically facilitating or transitioning things and helping forests to do this. There are a number of ways to do that, and this is not a management talk, so I'm happy to talk about this separately with you via email or via a separate Zoom. But there are ways in which we can promote the species that will be better adapted, and that's what they're visualizing here, is that yes, we may still lose this first species, however, there will be a transition period where ecosystem services are not lost, and in the end, we'll still have trees and forests and services on the landscape, just maybe in a different form. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up, and I'm going to thank the many collaborators and funders that are on this project. So again, I started this when I was faculty at Cal Poly in 2013 through 17. The work was funded by the California State Fire Safe Council and the California State Agricultural Research Institute. And then it was a collaboration with these 4 partners. So Cal Fire, Friends of Fiscalini Ranch, obviously Rancho Marino, and the Nature Conservancy. And at this time, I'll take some questions via the Q&A. I think we're going to have those moderated. And before I do, I just wanted to give a shout out to the sampling crew. Don Canestro and his daughter, Stella, are on the left. And then the 2 gentlemen on the right are the 2 undergraduate students that took on the bulk of this work and really got this project on the ground. Before we move on to the questions, the bottom is my email if you'd like to reach out with questions. I don't use social media, but I do have my website and then an experiment that I'm running across the Sierra Nevada that's looking at climate change mitigation. And so if you're interested in that type of stuff, that bottom website is the link to that. Thank you all.
Great. Well, thank you, Sarah, very much. We have a lot of great questions for you. And I just want to say that I learned a lot of new things about Rancho Marino and the forest there tonight, too. So thanks for helping us all understand a little bit more about this. I'm going to start out with the first question from Natalie Collar, and she's asking, have you looked at how temperature increases may or may not be reducing the resiliency of Monterey pine to fire?
That's a great question, and there's a lot in that question. So maybe I'll start with one, the primary threat to the Monterey pine forest, since I didn't talk about this in my talk, is urbanization. It's not necessarily fire or any of the other impacts. Fire has been absent from this landscape for so long that it's sort of hard to tell. I will say it'll be interesting to see what happens with within the Dolan fire, the CZU complex, Swanton Pacific Ranch, and that area burned, which potentially may have burned through some of the Monterey pine there. But fire has been so absent that it's really hard to know, and it's hard to test that. I will say that Monterey pine does not have inherent resilience traits. So it does not have cones that open with fire. It also doesn't have resistant traits. So it doesn't have thick bark that resists fire as it moves through there. I think what it does is it capitalizes on available light new resources after fire. And so that would just require some adjacent seed sources in order to be successful. No one to date is testing this because we have so few populations and such small acreages. And honestly, most of the Monterey pine forests have people living within them, which sort of challenges or complicates our ability to test or evaluate those things. And I'm hoping I answered that for you, Natalie.
Great, thank you. So here's another question from Laura Baker. And she asks, how do bishop pine compare to Monterey pine in terms of its capacity to withstand drought, pitch canker, rise in temperature? So kind of a little bit similar to the previous question. And sorry, there's a second part, which I'll just throw in right now too. Is there an impact of these factors on the range of bishop pine?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. And it's almost like you know what I'm talking about on Monday at another seminar. So I have a study of bishop pine on the PG&E Diablo Canyon power plant property, where they've been utilizing a prescribed fire program to burn between 200 and 400 acres every few years. And so bishop pine is a conifer that is resilient to fire. It has serotinous cones, which are cones that are closed with some sort of pitch or sap they open with extreme heat or fire, and they reproduce prolifically after fire. So much like Rocky Mountain lodgepole pine or knobcone pine for people that know those species. That species, based on our study there, is actually really benefiting from increases in fire at this time. So that fire return interval being brought back to the landscape, we now have prolific regeneration. We saw very little drought mortality over the same period of drought in the bishop pine forest. And we did see impacts of pine pitch canker, which are consistent with our findings of Monterey pine, that it seems to be targeting that sapling size class. And so that's always interesting to see too, that this non-native pathogen is preferentially taking out the same size classes of two different species. But to summarize that, bishop pine has far more resiliency to climate change than Monterey pine does for a number of reasons, but serotiny in general and increases in fire mean that it will be advantageous going forward.
So kind of related to that, to your last statement, so Elizabeth Kreider has a question, which is, what's the historical frequency of fire, excuse me, of fire in these areas? There's a lot of talk these days of fire as a management tool. So can you tell us a little bit about the frequency of fire in the area?
Yeah, so there are two, I'm trying to think, maybe one paper that Scott Stevens, he's a fire ecologist at Berkeley, at UC Berkeley, has put out on Monterey pine and bishop pine studies. Monterey pine is a hard species to study because it experiences high severity mortality in those events. And typically how we get fire scars or fire history data is we take tree cores of trees that have survived in the stand or an adjacent stand that have scars, and we look at accumulation of fire scars over time. We don't really get that in the Monterey pine forest, so it's sort of hard to tell. But sorry, I sort of lost my train of thought there. Can you repeat the question? I'm
Sure.
sort of silly.
Yeah. Well, basically, they're wondering about what the historical.
Oh, the return interval. Yeah. So if we plot the fire return interval across California, it falls into one of two categories, which is anywhere between 0 and 35 years or 35 and 80 years. And that's a frequency of fire that we expect for bishop pine on the coast and for chaparral. So it makes sense that it would fall into that 35 to 80 year return interval. I'm sorry, it's been a long work day.
No problem. Well, so I actually, I'm going to ask another question. This will probably be our last question of the evening. There's a lot of good Q&A. I want to apologize to the group out there for not being able to get to all of them. But this one is maybe directed more towards you as Dr. Bisbing as the scientist. And one of our guests asks, are there any tips you have for aspiring scientists to get into the research field? So how does somebody who wants to do what you do, get some experience or get involved in that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I really struggle with that. So I'm from Chicago originally. I went west because I fell in love with the West. And I also was like, I know what I want to, I know I want to be outside, but I don't know how to do this. And so I took a harder path than I think some people did, where I volunteered for a few years for the USGS and the National Park Service. I got fieldwork experience. It depends on what you want to do. I would say regardless, the first place to start is to try it out. So whether you take classes in field ecology or lab work where you're doing genomics work, I would practice it in school. And then I would also see if you can volunteer for some things, because I think the first filter on all of that is, do you actually want to be outside sampling in pouring rain conditions up a steep slope? Is that a good match for your personality? Or do you want to pipette for hours at a time? So that's probably the first filter. But I would start with volunteering and being enthusiastic. Professors like passion. They like people that are encouraged and engaged. And I'm more likely to have people come to my lab that want to talk science and want to learn and want to actually investigate things, because I think it's really all about curiosity.
Great answer, and a great question too. So thank you, Sarah, for, again, just a really great talk. That was super exciting. Like I said, I learned something new about Rancho Marino today, and I learned something new about forest and the science that you do. So it's with gratitude and appreciation that we're so happy to have you join us. And next week, so I just want to give a little preview for next week. If you like oak trees, we've got some more oak trees, and we're going to move over east to the Sedgwick Reserve, which is located in the San Ynez Valley. And we're going to have Professor Frank Davis, who's also the director of the Lacretz Research Center at Sedgwick Reserve, present the recent past and projected future of oak savannas of the San Ynez Valley. So please join us for that. And I just want to say thank you again to Sarah and to Keith and to you all for joining us this evening. And we'll see you next week. Great. Thanks.
Bye. Thank you all.